Thanks again for joining us for this webinar on electoral frontiers, combating disenfranchisement and building transparency. I'm excited to introduce our panelists for today's conversation. Aaron Mendelson is the news reporter for the Traces Gun Violence Data Hub. Previously, he was an investigative reporter at the Center for Public Integrity, covering voting, elections, and democracy. He covered stories ranging from restrictive voting laws to prison gerrymandering to the decades-long campaign by conservatives to capture state Supreme Courts. Ashton Pittman is a news editor at Mississippi Free Press. Previously, as a Jackson Free Press state reporter, he conducted multi-award-winning coverage of Mississippi's 2018 U.S. Senate special election, which made headlines across the country and kicked off a nationwide conversation about the legacy of segregation academies. Arlyssa Becenti is a DNA journalist with more than a decade of experience reporting on the Navajo Nation. As breaking news editor and Indigenous Affairs reporter for the Arizona Republic, she reported on Indigenous communities' experiences voting in Arizona's 2022 midterm. And moderating our conversation today is Brittany Gibson, a politics reporter covering campaigns and Georgia elections for Politico. Previously a Politico fellow, she also interned with the New York Daily News and CNN International in London and was a writing fellow at the American Prospect magazine. Everyone, you're welcome to start adding questions for our panelists at any time throughout this conversation. And I'm going to hand it over to Brittany and our panelists to give us a little bit of a brief introduction to their reporting projects.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So I want to just start off by throwing it straight to our panelists to talk a little bit about their reporting they've done with the Pulitzer Center. And let's start with Aaron.
Yes, so Aaron Mendelson here, very happy to be talking about this subject, and thanks to everyone who showed up on what for many of us is a holiday. I'm going to be talking about voter registration drives and a story I did earlier this year. If we can go to the next slide here. So this was the story that generously supported by the Pulitzer Center. I did it while I was at the Center for Public Integrity, where I worked for a couple of years covering voting. We did this story in partnership with NPR and some talented folks there, including Ashley Lopez, you see her on the byline. She co-reported this story with us, really examining a wave of laws that hampered the ability of groups to do voter registration drives in several states around the country. If we can go to the next slide. And there should be like one more. There we go. All right, here's everything. So that's the nut graph there at the top, that since the 2020 election, several states have passed legislation cracking down on this method of registering voters. Often election integrity concerns were cited. You can see the states that have done this on the map there, really all over the country. But the bottom line was often the same. It was that there were increased financial or even criminal penalties that the folks who were doing this work would face, and that many of them took a look at these penalties and said, it's simply not worth it for our group. So you can see there, kind of bottom right, what they call the aggregate fine in Florida. That's the largest amount that a group doing voter registration work could be fined for an entire year. As recently as 2021, the maximum total aggregate fine, $1,000. You can see that went up by 50-fold in 2022 after a bill passed, and then went up again another 5 times to $250,000 in 2023. I spoke to community groups, church groups that had been doing voter registration work for a long time that said that the risk of a $250,000 fine is simply too great, and we can't do this work anymore. Next slide. So stepping back a little bit and getting into why we wanted to do this reporting in the first place. A lot of coverage around these issues is about voting and the laws that govern what happens when you're casting the ballot. But in the United States, voting is a 2-step process. You have to first be registered, and then you have to actually vote. And the laws about registration vary significantly from state to state. In some places, like where I live in California, there's same-day registration. If you're eligible, you can simply go to the polls on election day and register there. In other states, there is a deadline, often weeks before the election. And if you miss that deadline and decide you want to vote on election day, you're SOL. In Texas, I believe it's 29 days before the election. So, if you registered today, it would simply be too late to cast a ballot in the election this year. These registration laws, they don't always get the same attention as voting laws, but they can make for great stories throughout the political calendar and throughout the election cycle, because folks can register at any time, of course. Stories about who is being removed from the rolls can be really important. Is it harder in your state than in neighboring states? What kind of changes are happening, and what might the political implications there be? And then when it comes to voter registration drives, one reason we thought this merited more coverage than it was receiving was that there was a really disproportionate impact on young voters and voters of color. And if you think back kind of historically, like, voter registration drives have been a huge piece of expanding the franchise in this country. Voter registration drives, big part of the women's suffrage movement, big part of the civil rights movement. Up to including more recently things like Rock the Vote to support sort of youth engagement. And so the data really bore this out in Florida, where we focused our reporting. About 13% of Black voters had used this method to register in recent years, compared to about 10% for Latino voters and just 2% for white voters. So any law changing, how this method of registration works was obviously going to, most likely disproportionately burden those groups that were using it the most. And this was also a notable case where in some of the litigation over these laws, the state elections director, Maria Matthews, acknowledged that her office was aware of these racial breakdowns. Next slide. There we go. And then just briefly, why we focused on Florida. A big part of it was the availability of data, data about the method of registration. It can be really challenging to come by in many states. I spent a lot of time looking into this. So if you are interested in reporting on this in your state, I've probably looked into it and would be happy to share what I learned. You can see the Florida's portal at the top right there. The political parties are big users of this method of registering to vote, and then lots of community engagement groups. Florida also, data was available on how many fines were actually assessed, and so we were able to make that chart. You see at the bottom right, showing the number of fines had skyrocketed basically. It was also an interesting state because they had passed several bills that affected voter registration drives. Passed one in 2021, another one in 2022, and then a third one in 2023. And that these laws went on to inspire Republican legislators in other states. In Tennessee, they were explicitly citing Florida's laws as model for what they were doing there. And then, we thought it was an important story to tell because there had been a clear impact. That if you looked at the period after that 2023 law passed and compared it to 4 years before, so the same point in the election cycle 4 years ago, that the number of people registering through voter registration drives had fallen by 95%, and just absolutely fallen off a cliff. We felt this was not getting the attention it deserved, and wanted to make a trip to Florida and do some on-the-ground reporting. And so I was able to do that with NPR. The Pulitzer Center was really fantastic to work with at a time of real organizational chaos for us at CPI. So a big shout out to them. And if you have any questions about this reporting or want to say hi, that's my email, and I would love to hear from folks.
You have to love Florida's Sunshine State open record laws. Thanks so much, Aaron. Okay, with that, let's go to Arlyssa. Talk a little bit about your reporting. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Arlyssa Becenti initiate not ordinate touching initiative, but any bashing, Kilachini Dashiche, Alukiani Dashinale. Hello, I'm Arlyssa Becenti. That's how I introduce myself as a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm a Diné journalist, and in 2022, the Arizona Republic had partnered up with the Pulitzer Center to write more in detail of the Native vote. Now, this was during the midterm. And during the midterm in 2022, the Navajo Nation was also going through its own election, its own presidential election. So I reported on both what was happening in the midterms as well as what was going on in my Navajo reservation. And so one thing that I made sure to, well, I don't have any slides and I'm sorry about that. But one thing I wanted to highlight was that during the 2022 election, there was attempts, obviously, that would try to suppress the Navajo, not Navajo Nation, but the tribal votes throughout Arizona with a proposition known as Prop 309. Now, this would have added another obstacle for Native voters. And this is just one of many that has been an attempt to suppress Native votes. Of course, this prop was voted down. It didn't make it through. But what it would have done, it would have changed Arizona voters' identification and mail-in procedures. And under the current law, a person voting in person to vote can either show a photo ID or two forms of ID without. I look like I'm frozen.
You're frozen, but we can still hear you if you can hear us.
Okay, that was worrying me. Okay, so you can two forms of ID without a photo, and Prop 309 would have eliminated the alternative to photo ID for in-person voting. Now that would have caused a huge problem because Native tribal members have a hard time getting voter IDs because of rural addressing, as well as transportation to getting these IDs. It makes a hindrance for tribal members. So in that obstacle in itself, Prop 309 was seen as something that was going to disenfranchise a lot of voters. And that is one thing that I made sure to look into during my time with the Pulitzer Center, and as well as when it came to the Navajo Nation election. Now, this was a very important election because we have 24 legislative leaders. And for the first time, women leaders had come out and they were voted in the most that it had ever been before. There was 9 out of 24. And this is the first time that a Navajo Nation speaker was elected being a woman. So that in itself was just historical. And so that is what I basically really just delved into while I was working with them, along with Pulitzer Center. Oh, and one thing also was 2022 also was right after election 2020. And that is when Arizona turned from red to blue. And not only that, the Native vote was kind of not taken as seriously. So you can see that in one of my articles where, tribal members from the Salt River Pima, Maricopa Indian community look back and see how CNN at that time put down how many people were voting, and they used something else to describe the Native vote. And we were considered something else during this election when it was our vote that heavily changed the state from red to blue. So that was something also that I wrote about during this project. So that's what I worked on, and I'm still frozen, so I'm sorry. It's kind of just caught me up.
No worries, thank you. And we'll follow up on that. So next, let's just go to Ashton, hear about your reporting.
Hi, I'm Ashton Pittman. I'm with the Mississippi Free Press. I'm the news editor. So our reporting dates back to the 2020 election. That year, of course, was a pandemic year, the beginning, the first election of the pandemic. And we obviously had a lot of social distancing rules. So we knew a lot of voting precincts were going to change that year just because of that. So we asked what we thought was a simple question: which polling places have changed? And we thought it would be easy to get an answer. And in fact, it turns out that's a really difficult process in Mississippi. the Secretary of State's office initially released a list showing that 17 precincts had changed. And it turns out they had just asked local election officials for, what their changes were. But almost immediately when they released that list, we realized that there was one changed precinct someone on our team knew about that wasn't on the list. So we made some public records requests. And we were able to identify, through getting a list of the database in the system, we were able to identify at least 55 precincts that had changed that the Secretary of State's office apparently did not know about, affecting about 65,000 people. And the cause of this is just generally an outdated database system and a patchwork system of election administration management across 82 counties, where in many cases, local election officials aren't communicating with one another and aren't communicating well with the state. And since the Secretary of State's database had errors, and it turns out this is a long-running problem. It didn't just begin in 2020. Since that database had errors, that meant that voters who use the state's polling place locator tool online were being sent to the wrong precinct. And we had heard for years, we had had people for years tell them this sent them to the wrong precinct. And we continue to hear this. Voters get sent to the wrong precinct. The Secretary of State's own mother was sent to the wrong precinct. So we've had these complaints for years. And in 2020, we talked to a lot of people who went to stand in line, and they stood in line for an hour or longer, only to find out they were at the wrong polling place, that their polling place had changed. They hadn't been notified. Secretary of State's office didn't know about it. And then they had to, on a work day, go stand at a different polling place to wait in line. So in a state like Mississippi, where we have this history of voter disenfranchisement, very intentional voter disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, it was just important to us that people at least have accurate information about where they vote. So we put together a list of voting precincts that year and changes, and then we continued doing this project because we started finding more problems. We started finding that we actually had to call all 82 counties, because we did a public records request for what was in the database, that didn't mean anything, because a lot of times it wasn't being updated because there's nothing forcing the 82 counties to keep this stuff up to date. So, for example, we found 70 polling places had changed ahead of the June 22 primaries, 28 more by November 2022, 160 more by the 2023 primaries, and on and on. And the last time we did it, which was the 2024 primaries, we found that there were 90 precincts across 19 counties where there was missing, incomplete, incorrect, or just outdated information in the state database, in addition to precincts that weren't being that people weren't being notified had changed. So this is just, for us, you talk about voter disenfranchisement in Mississippi, and this is just a really basic thing that people should be able to know where to go vote on election day. So we're excited to be doing this work with the Pulitzer Center this year through Story Reach to expand this project, both during the 2024 election and beyond. We're going to be reporting not only on precinct changes and providing an accurate list of statewide precincts this year, which there's no other place to get because the state doesn't put it out, of course, but to continue just diving into the data and to do solutions work that examines the issues, the root of the issues, and how to address those problems.
Wow. Let's keep building on this common thread in all of your reporting is understanding the different agencies and nuances and new laws, new legislation within these state governments. So let me throw it back to Aaron about just talk a little bit about how you track this new legislation, how you report on its impacts, and how you just follow what government is doing. I think all three of you have just been incredible watchdogs on government in these small lanes of different parts of the voting process. So let's dig in on how you do that.
Yeah, it was really through keeping tabs on changes to these laws over the course of a year. I thought about pitching a story in 2023 and didn't end up doing it, and I'm glad we waited till 2024. But I'm just subscribed to election-related newsletters. Use the Voting Rights Lab tool to track election legislation, check election law blog every day. So I was just noticing that there were, these laws passing or being debated in states across the country. And it really helped that we wait to do this story, because by that point there had been litigation. And so when you talk about impact, it's often very difficult to pin down the impact of changes to voting and registration and election law. You can't prove a counterfactual if the voting laws changed and turnout changed. Like it's often just irresponsible to tie them one to one. So in our case, it was very helpful that these things had been very litigated, and that whatever kind of data legislators were relying on would come to light through that. So certainly, if you're reporting on laws that were not just passed, I would dive into the legal record. Often these things are challenged in both state and federal court, so definitely be checking both dockets. And then in terms of legislation, watch the meetings. Like, it's really boring. You will get extremely bored, but make some coffee, crack open a beer, and watch those meetings, because 2 hours into it, someone will say like the lead of your story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good advice. Ashton, could you just pick up on that? You've walked through really well how you were following this in Mississippi. But if you could just add as well how you got those voter stories, how you heard about people who were in line for 1 hour at the wrong place because of this system failure.
Yeah, so that one just one precinct I can think of where that was a huge issue was in Madison County in 2020. And I think this just kind of shows how building trust in communities helps you get people come to you and they bring stories to you. So there was a woman in Madison County who was running for office, and she had just been canvassing her local neighborhood. She had information on voting precincts that she had gotten from the local circuit clerk, I believe. And so she'd just been canvassing her neighborhood. And she noticed that when she was talking to voters in certain neighborhoods, that none of them knew where they were supposed to vote on election day. All of them seemed to think they were going to vote at this one precinct they had voted at for years. And she had something different. So what she found was that their precinct had been redrawn just weeks before the election. The lines had been redrawn. So this was a precinct that was, I think, like just crudely 50% white and then 50% Black and Hispanic. But it had been redrawn so that now it was overwhelmingly white, and many mostly Black and Hispanic residents who were in that precinct previously had been drawn into another precinct that was where the actual voting place was much smaller, more tightly packed. It was in an apartment office. And so actually thousands of mostly Black and Hispanic voters had been moved, and the county officials had not informed them as they're supposed to do under state law. So she came to us and she said, "Hey, I'm talking to voters and they're finding this." And so based on her tip, we were able to dig deeper into this. And this was mere days before the election. We were able to put out a story letting these voters know that, I think it was about 3,000 mostly Black and Hispanic voters had been moved. And so a lot of people, so in response to that story, the county started trying to inform people, and some more organizations picked up on it. And we still on election day had people, though, hundreds of people show up to that precinct who didn't know they had moved. And one of them was on our team because he did not read our stories that week. So he ended up being able to get pictures of what the line was like and to describe, some of the angst he saw there from people, including him, who had shown up and waited hours in line. So that for just that one precinct, that's how we found that out. Otherwise, we've put out feelers asking people, "Hey, if you have a problem when you go to vote, message us."
Sometimes mistakes just work out like that. He got photos for the story, so it all ties in.
Right.
Well. Arlyssa, if you're still with us, I'd love if you could just, keep building on this and talk a little bit about how in your reporting as well, you navigate two layers of bureaucracy, both the Arizona state and obviously federal government, but also the indigenous governments that you've been reporting on.
It's rather interesting because I have to be in tune with not only my tribal government, but also outside in Phoenix. And we have a large urban Native population in Phoenix metro area. And so, just being able to inform them of what's going on in their reservations, on their election, mostly Navajo Nation, because that's what I kind of focus on, as well as being in focus with what they're going through in the urban setting and the state setting as well. So I do listen a lot to organizations, Native run voter organizations that are out there. And there's a lot that are really good. They're all good actually, because they know that going out there and finding out about this information and going out to the rural spaces of tribal communities throughout Arizona is vital in order for this information to be put out there in order for people to start voting. Now, when I was interviewing this one lady, or I think I heard her speak, and she is a board county supervisor in Maricopa. She said that tribal students in Arizona State University will drive 5 hours to their reservations to vote in their tribal elections, but they don't do that for urban or in the urban setting for state or federal elections. And she wants to change that. So just being able to listen to what these organizations know and trying to get it out there, as well as me understanding these propositions that just like pop up sometimes that you just don't really even know what's happening, like redistricting as well has been an issue with Arizona and the tribal communities, because we have 22 federally tribal recognized tribes in Arizona. So just knowing all of this, it does get confusing, and it's very daunting at times. But yeah, that's how I basically try to stay up to date with these types of elections.
That makes sense. And if you could just continue speaking a little bit about why it's so important to stay up to date and to follow this relatively smaller part of the electorate. Like why is that important, and how crucial is it to have that focus on these indigenous communities where you're reporting?
Because Native votes, as many people, like I think right now, especially since what happened in 2020, Native votes are being seen as important when it wasn't before as much as before. Now you have Republicans coming in trying to sway, because we've all heard that Native voters are Democrats. So that's not the case anymore. We're not a monolith. We're not all Democrats. There are a lot of Republicans out there. So we have Republicans coming in and trying to sway the vote to Republicans, and they saw how powerful these votes are when it came to the Democrats as well. So being able to hone in on these propositions that are suppressing Native votes is important, because when we show up in numbers, it's very strong, and that's always been the message with these organizations. Like Arizona Native Votes is one organization, Wingbeat 88 is an organization, and even Arizona State University has their own little group that also emphasizes Native votes. So you have all these resources to teach people about why they need to vote, why they need to be up to date with these propositions, and what could be the ramifications if people vote on these propositions. And like we saw what we saw this summer with the Arizona Supreme Court saying that you're going to have to show proof of citizenship for Arizona voters. Now that's going to be difficult, even more so for Native voters, because some are born not in traditional hospitals. We have elderly voters who aren't born in hospitals, who don't have birth certificates. My mom didn't have a birth certificate until the year 2000 because she wasn't born in a hospital. So trying to get these identifications that people are wanting it becomes a obstacle, and it becomes very time consuming, especially when you don't have the resources to get to these offices in order to get these vital documents, in order to get a voter ID. And so knowing and understanding what these small parts of the election is, it is really important to Native voters.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel like that echoes very similar themes as what was in your reporting, Aaron. If you could just talk about, this was in your presentation, but if you could just expand a little bit more about the gap that these voter registration drive groups were filling in the states that you focused on.
Right. Yes. A lot of these groups reach voters who are some of the hardest to reach voters, right? The people who are not on the polls already, for whom an election, especially if it's weeks or months away, is not going to be front of mind. And these states, it bears mentioning, the 6 states we focused on are all states that do not have automatic voter registration. So there are some places where if you go to the DMV to get your driver's license updated, they will update your voter registration unless you ask them not to. That's not the case in any of these states. It's the burden is much more on the individual voter, especially in a place like Florida, where they're removing people from the rolls with much greater speed than they used to. So yeah, they're really coming in and filling that gap, and a lot of our in-person reporting focused on this. So you saw kind of the lead images from our story, which was a man named Humberto Orjuela, who we went out in the field with. He was registering voters in the parking lot of an El Presidente supermarket in the Orlando area. This is not glamorous work. It was like 11 a.m. It was already past 90 degrees, sunny spring day. It's sweaty. There's a lot of rejection. A lot of people, get mad or don't understand what he's doing. But for him, a day is a success if he can register 10 people. It really helps talking to folks with Poder Latinx, which is the organization that he works for. They say a lot of the people we register, it's immensely important to them that we can speak to them in Spanish, right? Somebody who approaches them and wants to speak English, that's not going to reach a monolingual Spanish speaker. Same thing. A lot of groups that have been doing this for a long time are related to the Black church. I talked to a woman named LaVon Bracey, who's been doing voter registration work in Florida since the 1960s. She actually personally desegregated her high school in Florida and has registered literally thousands of voters over the course of her life. And a similar story there, it's like showing up at a high school football game on a Friday, like being a part of the community, like your voice carries weight that someone parachuting in may not, or that a billboard from the Secretary of State, maybe that'll reach some people, but not everyone. So it's really these ties to the communities that these groups believe kind of help get those people on the rolls who might not otherwise be on the rolls.
Oh, wow, that's incredible reporting. And so then let me just go back to you, Ashton, and Mississippi does have some interesting elections every now and then, but you're not having the same national spotlight, especially in a presidential year, as some other states. Just talk a little bit about the immediate local impact that your reporting is having, as you've been discussing in past stories, past elections, and really what it means to the voters and potential voters who are getting this immediate impact or information, from your reporting.
Yeah, I think something we hear a lot from voters, whether it's in solution circles, which are meetings we have in communities, or online, where we basically just get people together to talk about issues they care about. What we hear from them is that it's good to hear someone talking about these kinds of issues, because they can read the stories about what who's polling what one day, what the candidates are saying about one another. But a lot of people just really want really basic election information. And in Mississippi can have a hard time getting it sometimes. I think we've also, in addition to publishing things like, that take more investigation, more work, like the precinct issue, we've also just been publishing things like guides on how to get a free voter ID, because in Mississippi, you have to have a voter ID. And a lot of people don't know that you can actually get a free one if you don't have like a driver's license or something. So people really like when we publish just these little basic guides that give basic election information. And they like feeling like they're being heard, because you don't always hear back from someone when you ask a political official about a problem. And you don't always hear back when you ask a newsroom either. But people, it really helps build trust just when you take someone seriously when they say, hey, my precinct seems to have changed, but no one told me about it. So I think that's one of the biggest impacts, is just building trust, and also people feeling heard.
No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I'll just say for the audience, keep throwing your questions in the chat. We'll pivot to those very shortly. Chat or Q&A function. I'll find it wherever you put it. Let me just go back to the panelists one last time before we go to your questions. And I'd love to just throw it out there, or for anyone to answer, things that you're looking out for as early voting is starting in more and more states for this presidential election. Things you're looking for between now and election day for your reporting, or even for stories down the line. Whoever'd like to pick that up.
Well, gosh, I am kind of on a different beat these days, but am completely fascinated by state Supreme Courts. Did a lot of reporting on these institutions last year in 2023. And I would say if you live in a state where your state Supreme Court justices are elected, you should absolutely be paying attention to that. The balance of power on state Supreme Courts. That shifting can make an enormous difference. In Iowa, it made the difference between abortion being a right guaranteed by the state constitution and not. In North Carolina, the political makeup of the court changed, and they decided to rehear cases on redistricting and voter ID that they had just heard in the previous term, and then decided them in the other direction. I think the U.S. Supreme Court gets a lot of attention, and this sort of journalism has kind of woken up to covering that as a political body made up of political actors. But I don't think state Supreme Courts, which are the final word on your state's constitution and what rights you have under your state's constitution, they don't always get the same attention. And so I would put in a little plug for those races. Oh, and one other thing, just on the subject of judges, I used to work at the public radio station here in Los Angeles, and in our voter guides we would publish, there's always stuff about like the local county level judges, and that would get a ton of traffic because people would be like sitting down trying to figure out who they're going to vote for, and there's no advertising in these races, like very little information. And so just the fact that like a local media outlet was putting out reliable information was a surprisingly big driver of traffic.
Subscribing to local news is, I think, a main takeaway for everyone in the audience.
Okay.
Ashton, Arlyssa, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I'm looking forward towards this early voting, actually, these organizations are really going above and beyond trying to get people out there to vote early. Just this past weekend, actors Mark Ruffalo and Rama had come to the Navajo Nation and walked 3 miles with an organization called Protect the Sacred to an early voting ballot box with the Navajo community. And so these organizations take it really seriously to get people, aware of how important voting is, especially early voting. But what I'm looking towards right now, or what I'm focusing on, is In 2020, during the general election, there was over 2,000 voters placed on what is called a suspense list in the Apache County here in Arizona. And that was primarily due to questions surrounding their residency. So the county put in an incorrect precinct, and these voters therefore did not show up on the voting roster when they went to vote on election day at no fault of their own. So these types of issues that have, doesn't seem like it made much news or headway is really problematic. And these type of little issues that counties do have within the Navajo Nation or other tribal communities is something that I'm looking for, because it seems as though it's something that is just made up on the spot. I feel like the rules are just being made up as they go. So that's what I'm going to be looking towards for.
So I think for us, beyond just the precincts work, another thing we're really interested in Mississippi when it comes to elections is our campaign finance system. And I think that's another example of a place where it's very hard to get good data and to use it. For example, in most states, I think you can go to a page and you can search for the name of a donor or the name of a campaign, and you can pull up a list out of a database of donations to that campaign by that donor. In Mississippi, I'll give you an example. So I wanted to find out back in 2020, Governor Tate Reeves put together this commission in April 2020 that I think recommended he recommended bringing lockdown measures to an end. And I just wanted to find out how much, these 6 people he appointed, how much did they and their businesses donate to him? So in most states, this would maybe take a minute or two because you could just type that information in. For me, what I had to do, I think it took maybe 8 to 10 hours, because our campaign finance system, there's no database you can search that's reliable because candidates don't have to put information in database format. So I had to download a bunch of PDFs, hundreds, maybe dozens of PDFs to be accurate, dozens of PDFs, some of which were printed, looked like they had been printed and scanned over and over, some of which were sideways, upside down, almost unreadable, some of which were handwritten, and then run that through my computer to make it so that they're searchable, and search them all individually to find the name of each donor. And then just add that up manually. That is what our campaign finance system in Mississippi looks like. It is a relic of the 20th century. So that's something I want us to tackle more in the future, is our campaign finance system and why it's such a mess.
Wow, that is incredible. I didn't know Mississippi was making the FEC look so functional.
I love searching the FEC for donations.
I bet it feels like no work at all compared to that. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing. I really appreciate it. Let's pivot to audience questions. Our first one here is, what tips do you have for younger journalists focusing on election coverage coming up this November? And also, do you have any tips for safety when you're out reporting? Ashton, I might pick on you as an editor on this panel to go in on that.
Yeah. So for me, I would say go into it foremost with a democracy-centered mindset, not centered on just the politics and the polls. Centered on democracy, on voters, on what they care about. And then I would say approach issues. Do coverage that focuses on issues and focuses on the stakes of elections for people, because I think something we often find is that people know kind of the sports like play-by-play, who's up, who's down in the polls, but a lot of people don't know what the stakes are on their lives. And after the 2016 election, I think a lot of people realized the stakes of a presidential election for the Supreme Court and the stakes of the Supreme Court for their lives, who I'll be honest, the media in 2016 and honestly before had not done a great job of telling people what the stakes are. So the stakes, the issues, democracy, and how these things affect their lives. What do offices? What do not who are the not just who are the personalities running, but what does the office that you're voting for actually do? What is its function? Focus on telling people that, and don't assume that people know these things, because people have a lot going on in their lives and not everyone has time to be a news junkie and politics junkie. As far as being safe, that's a good question. But generally be smart. If you're going in a contentious situation, consider whether or not you need multiple people to go together. And just take precautions. Some rooms you can walk into and they're scarier to be in. But that is also part of the job.
Do either Aaron or Arlyssa, excuse me, either of you want to add to that as well?
Yeah,
Tips for younger journalists.
To build off something Ashton was saying, really centering issues and talking about stakes, a good place to do that is coverage of ballot measures. So I think it can be very valuable, especially for a young journalist, to do a story that is not anywhere going to have the word Trump or Harris in it, right? That is just completely separated, sometimes even from a partisan lens. And these ballot measures are literally about issues, the kind of ideologies pushing for and against them can cut across party lines in ways that are sometimes very interesting. There's sort of raw political power being exercised and what gets on the ballot, who's supporting it, what the campaigns are around there. So I would consider supporting those. They can often have such a direct impact in your life. A state ballot measure or a county municipal ballot measure, it's not the first thing on anyone's mind, but a lot of people aren't tracking this stuff until the very end, so your reporting can help put this on folks' radar.
Great. Okay, so I'll move to the next question, which is what tips do you have for preparing an editorial calendar for election coverage? This is for a news organization covering national news, but wanting to produce local election news in a few places. And so I think you could kind of take this question in two ways. What is your election calendar like for your audience, for informing readers, listeners? But also if you have a different thought process for your own kind of personal calendar, personal diary of like, I need to follow up with, the Secretary of State's office or County Board of Election office on these dates for this information. If that is relevant as well, I'd love to hear that part of it. Any takers?
Sure. I'm not an editor or authority figure in my newsroom, but I will mention, I mentioned my experience in public radio. And one thing that we dealt with in a state like California, where it takes a long time to count the vote, is that there's this mismatch. The moment when there's the most interest in the returns is election night, but we often don't know who won on election night or until quite late on election night. So it really behooved us to be prepared and have things in the can that would explain to people how the vote is counted. Explainers about things like local races and ballot measures, because it just would have been irresponsible to tell our audience like, okay, 0.1% of the vote has been counted, and like, here's who your next mayor is. We just didn't know. So looking at things like that, finding the interesting details. Every year I tweet the detail that in Los Angeles County, some of the votes are transported to the voting center by speedboats from Catalina Island. They take the ballots there and bring them in by speedboat from the Antelope Valley over the some mountains from the Los Angeles basin. The sheriff's deputies put the votes on helicopters and bring them in. So people like that. And in a moment where we don't have a lot to say about the results, those process stories can be helpful.
Yeah, LA is a really unique place for ballot counting and election bureaucracy. Let me take this next audience question. This is specifically for Arlyssa. In what ways are the major presidential candidates reaching out to Indigenous communities in Arizona? And in your opinion, are they doing enough?
I believe that the Biden-Harris organization, the Harris organization, has always done a lot when it came to engaging with Native voters. Especially in 2020, they had a big bus that came out, and Harris has another group of Native voter organizations to help garner more support for her group. And so I believe that they do more than most, but I believe that kind of outreach is being seen by other parties and they are following suit. We all know Carrie Lake, and other Republican Congressman Eli Crane. They have come out to the Navajo Nation a couple of times, but when in 2020, Carrie Lake had never, I don't believe, I did not see Carrie Lake coming out, or I think it was 2022 when she first wanted to run. I did not see her come out to the Navajo Nation, although she said that she did. But this year alone, she's been very visible on the Navajo Nation. So people are seeing what the Navajo Nation vote can do. So they are, they have their organizations already in place, like the Democratic Party, and others are just following suit and doing just that as well.
Okay, and then I think we have time for one last question. It's a little outside of the scope of our or your reporting and our conversation tonight, but it's an interesting one. So I'm going to throw it out to the whole panel. Why do you all think there are still some people who believe that there was widespread fraud in past U.S. elections?
So I could take this one. Coming from Mississippi, where there's always been fear mongering about anything that expands voting. I'm in one of the states that is probably the hardest to register and to vote in. You have to register 30 days before an election. There's not really, there's no kind of universal early voting. There are some limited absentee ballot options. If you're over 65, if you have a disability, it's documented. And to vote by mail, the only mail vote option, which is also absentee voting, requires 2 notarizations. So we're a state where voting is hard, and the powers that be, whether it's the old Dixiecrats that run our state or the Republicans that run our state now, seem to like to keep it that way. So one of the things that they've long done in the state, certainly way longer than I've been alive, is fearmonger about voter fraud and inflame those concerns to justify passing more voting restrictions, such as our recent so-called ballot harvesting ban. So, the reason you're hearing a ton about it now on the national stage is, of course, because Donald Trump has ever since 2016 been screaming voter fraud baselessly and spreading lies about voter fraud. And you can, even in 2016, when he won the Electoral College, he still said there was voter fraud in California, I think, because he was saying he would have also won the popular vote if not for 3 million illegal votes in California. So that is why you hear it on the national level, but it predates Donald Trump. This is something that in states like mine, especially with Jim Crow histories, there has long been a need to push the idea of voter fraud while not addressing things like just basic issues of making sure voters have good information. This is just a long running thing, and it's not unique to Donald Trump. Donald Trump's just made it a lot more prominent.
That's really important context. And yeah, the 2016 Trump comments are kind of forgotten now. but after what happened in 2020, but it's
Right.
really important context. Arlyssa, would you want to add a little bit to this as well? You mentioned Carrie Lake, who's now running for Senate in your state. She raised her profile quite a lot, talking about election fraud in 2020. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think they use voter fraud as a way to make this this need for more stipulations when it comes to voter registration, such as the Prop 309, which I spoke about, and then there was also one that the former governor Doug Ducey had passed, and I forget what it was called, but that would also ask for proof of citizenship, and that was passed in, I forget, 2020, I believe, or 2022. My years get mixed up, but yeah, they use this voter fraud dialogue in order to make it known, like, we need these new stipulations, and that's one of the reasons why it's important to understand and know what's being brought onto the ballot when it comes to propositions.
And then Aaron, do you want to add a word on this? Bit of a weird question, or not weird, but important, but
Sure. Yeah.
this fraud question.
Yeah, I would just add, voter fraud is a real thing, but it's just vanishingly rare. It's so infrequent. So there will no doubt be scattered instances of voter fraud in the general election this year. But it's important to contextualize those. And when it comes to people making claims, especially demonstrably untrue claims about voter fraud, it's important that when we're quoting those people talking about other things, that we let our audiences know that they are not able to get the facts straight about elections, and that you should be considering that when they're talking about any other issue.
Thank you.
Well,
back to you,
Michaela. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Brittany, for moderating this wonderful conversation. We're nearing the end of our time, so we are going to wrap things up here, but I would encourage you all to take a look at all of this panelist's work and do your own reading and research as well. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would also encourage you to join us for a next webinar in our election series. On Thursday, October 24th, we're going to be discussing technology's influence on democratic processes and civil liberties in the United States, India, and Russia, with a couple of our AI accountability fellows and some researchers on the topics. So I shared that registration link in the resources tab here on this webinar, and you can also find this on our website if you're curious to continue some of these different conversations, but on similar themes. And we appreciate all of you for joining us today. And for those of you who are able, please consider supporting our work, which supports journalists like our panelists in telling these kind of stories. Finally, we'd really appreciate if you take just a second after this webinar ends to complete a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback as we work to improve our events and make sure they're the best that they can be for our audiences. So thank you so much again to all of our panelists, and I hope you all have a good rest of your evenings.